FBI agent Marcus Hargrove sat in the midst of luxury, hidden behind a sharp suit and calm demeanor, but the sting of the bartender's sneer cut deeper than any criminal threat. The mission was crucial, but in this moment, the real enemy wasn't just the arms dealer he was chasing, it was prejudice, staring him down across the bar. Little did the bartender know, the tables were about to turn. Before we get started, don't forget to like, subscribe, and let us know where you're watching from. Let's dive in. The bar exuded opulence, the kind of place where the rich and famous indulged in their luxury, disconnected from the everyday struggles that most people faced. The place shimmered in soft hues of gold, the lights from grand chandeliers casting a warm, almost hypnotic glow over the patrons who were deep in conversations about stock prices, vacations, and the art that hung on their walls. Jazz melodies hummed in the background, underscoring the room's wealth with an elegant touch of culture. But Special Agent Marcus Hargrove wasn't interested in the ambiance or the high-class clientele tonight. He was here for one reason: to find and apprehend his target. Sitting in a corner, Marcus blended in seamlessly, though this particular establishment wasn't the kind of place where he would typically feel at ease. His tailored suit, dark and sharp, matched the attire of the other men at the bar, but Marcus knew well enough that appearances were only skin-deep. No matter how polished his shoes or how expensive his watch, his presence here was likely an anomaly to many of the patrons and to the staff. And it wouldn't be long before someone made it known. Marcus was on the trail of a dangerous criminal, a notorious arms dealer who operated in the shadows of luxury. These kinds of places with no questions asked, places where everyone looked the other way, were perfect for meetings that needed to stay off the radar. His cover had to remain intact. This was no small-time operation. The arms dealer had connections with violent organizations that spread across borders, and tonight, Marcus had intel that the dealer would be here, meeting with one of his associates. It was a delicate situation that required Marcus to stay sharp, even as his surroundings seemed designed to lull him into a false sense of security. His eyes moved discreetly around the room, scanning the faces of men in expensive suits, women draped in jewelry, and servers darting between tables with trays of fine champagne. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary yet. Still, Marcus knew better than to relax. But the moment he approached the bar, Marcus's instincts told him trouble was brewing. He could feel the eyes on him, the quick, darting glances from the bartender who had been serving drinks effortlessly to everyone else. There was something in the man's posture that felt off. Marcus had seen that look before, too many times to count. It was the look of someone who had already decided who Marcus was before he'd even said a word. The bartender was a middle-aged man, lean, with graying hair slicked back neatly. His face was hard, his eyes cold and calculating. He looked Marcus up and down, but not in the way one might look at a customer they're eager to serve. No, this was different. The man's gaze lingered on Marcus's skin, his suit, and then flickered away as if deciding that Marcus wasn't worth his time. A knot tightened in Marcus's stomach, a feeling he had long learned to bury. He wasn't here to make friends or to be liked. He was here to do his job. Still, this wasn't going to be easy. "Whiskey, neat," Marcus said, his voice calm but authoritative. His FBI training had taught him how to command a room without needing to raise his voice. He wasn't asking. He was giving an order, much like he would in the field. But the bartender's response wasn't what Marcus had expected. Instead of turning to fill the glass, the man crossed his arms over his chest, leaning against the counter with a sneer on his lips. "We don't serve people like you here," the bartender said, his voice low but dripping with disdain. It was a phrase loaded with meaning, a verbal dagger Marcus had heard in different forms throughout his life. He felt his pulse quicken, the weight of the words hanging heavy in the air between them. It wasn't just about the drink. It was about everything. The suit, the bar, the very idea that someone like Marcus didn't belong in a place like this. Marcus stood his ground, his jaw tightening. He'd been in this kind of situation more times than he could count, and each time the sting felt just as sharp. He could walk away, avoid the confrontation. It wasn't worth blowing his cover over a racist bartender. But a part of him, the part that had worked twice as hard to earn his place in the FBI, the part that had grown up fighting for respect, in a world that often refused to give it, refused to let this slide. "Excuse me," Marcus said, keeping his tone measured, though inside, the anger simmered. "I don't think you know who I am." The bartender chuckled, the sound grating. "Oh, I know exactly who you are," he said, his eyes narrowing. "And we don't need your kind causing any problems here. Why don't you try somewhere else?" For a second, Marcus considered showing the man his badge, letting him know exactly who he was dealing with. He could watch the smug look on the bartender's face melt away, replaced with fear and regret. But Marcus knew that wasn't an option. He was undercover, and any slip could compromise the entire operation. The arms dealer could walk in at any moment, and Marcus needed to be ready. Instead, he took a deep breath, the cool, calculated agent in him taking over. He stepped back from the bar, his eyes never leaving the bartender's sneering face. "Thanks anyway," Marcus muttered, his voice laced with a barely restrained edge. As Marcus turned and walked away, he could feel the bartender's gaze burning into his back. The anger boiled in his chest, but he knew he couldn't afford to let it show. He had a job to do, and he wasn't about to let a racist bartender ruin it. Finding a quiet corner near the back of the bar, Marcus sat down, his senses still on high alert. He pulled out his phone, pretending to scroll through messages, though his focus remained on scanning the room. The arms dealer could walk in at any moment, and Marcus needed to be ready. But despite his efforts to stay focused on the mission, Marcus couldn't shake the bitter taste of the encounter at the bar. It wasn't just about the drink. It was about everything. The way people saw him, judged him, dismissed him. Even in a suit, even as a federal agent, Marcus was reminded that in the eyes of some, he would never belong. His phone buzzed, interrupting his thoughts. It was a text from Sarah Monroe, his partner on the operation, who was stationed outside in the surveillance van. "Any sign of the target?" the message read. Marcus typed back quickly. "Nothing yet. Keep your eyes open." As he put his phone away, Marcus's gaze swept across the bar again, his attention snapping back to the mission. He wasn't here for himself. He was here to bring down a criminal, a dangerous man who had slipped through the cracks for far too long. And nothing, not the bartender's prejudice, not the tension in the room, was going to stop him from doing his job. But deep down, Marcus knew that this night would be one he wouldn't forget. Not just because of the mission, but because of the way it had already peeled back the layers of the world he lived in. No matter how hard he worked, no matter how far he climbed, there would always be people who saw only the color of his skin. Still, Marcus reminded himself, he wasn't here to prove anything to the bartender or anyone else. His actions, his success, would speak for him. And tonight, he would make sure that justice was served, not just for the arms dealer, but for anyone who had ever been made to feel like they didn't belong. And as the night wore on, Marcus had no idea just how deeply karma would come for the bartender who had dismissed him so easily. Marcus sat in the dim corner of the bar, his back to the polished wood wall, his senses heightened, and his emotions still simmering just beneath the surface. The humiliating encounter with the bartender echoed in his mind, but Marcus forced himself to focus. He was a professional, after all. He'd been trained to set his emotions aside when the job required it, and tonight, the stakes were far too high for him to lose his cool. The jazz music drifted softly through the room, the hum of low conversations creating a pleasant din that masked the tension Marcus felt. He sipped the sparkling water a passing server had brought him. Not the whiskey he had initially requested, but at least something to keep him from standing out as the only one without a drink. His eyes scanned the bar, taking in every detail. The way the bartender continued to chat easily with the other patrons, the subtle nods exchanged between some of the regulars, the occasional glances in his direction that made him feel like he was being watched. There was a subtle undercurrent of unease here, something Marcus couldn't quite put his finger on. The place was too perfect, too polished, like a stage set carefully to hide the truth lurking just behind the curtains. Minutes passed, and still there was no sign of the target. Marcus began to wonder if their intel had been wrong, if the dealer had decided to change his plans at the last minute. It wouldn't be the first time a criminal slipped through their fingers, especially one as slippery as the man they were after tonight. The arms dealer had evaded capture for years, using his wealth and connections to stay just one step ahead of the law. But Marcus wasn't going to let him get away this time. He had worked too hard, waited too long for this moment. Just as Marcus was beginning to question whether the night would turn out to be a bust, the door to the bar swung open. Marcus didn't have to turn around to know someone important had just walked in. He could feel the shift in the air, the subtle way conversations paused, eyes flicking toward the entrance. He glanced up and saw him. The target. The man who walked in exuded wealth and power, his presence commanding attention without needing to ask for it. He was dressed impeccably in a dark suit, his hair slicked back in the same way Marcus had seen in the surveillance photos. Everything about him screamed confidence, from the expensive watch on his wrist to the way he moved through the room, his eyes scanning his surroundings with the precision of someone who knew they had enemies everywhere. But most importantly, he matched the description Marcus had memorized from the briefing earlier that day. Victor Devereux, the arms dealer who had slipped through the cracks of the justice system for far too long. Marcus's heart quickened. This was it, the moment he had been waiting for. Devereux made his way toward the bar, his gaze passing over Marcus without recognition. He was here for a meeting, but with whom? Marcus couldn't risk losing track of him now. His hand went instinctively to his earpiece, and he tapped it twice, signaling to Sarah. "Target's here," he murmured under his breath, barely moving his lips. He just walked in. There was a pause on the other end before Sarah's calm voice crackled through the earpiece. "Copy that. I've got eyes on the entrance. Let me know if anything changes." Marcus watched as Devereux approached the bar, his eyes narrowing slightly as he observed the interaction between the arms dealer and the bartender. The same bartender who had humiliated Marcus just moments ago was now all smiles, his earlier arrogance replaced by an almost nervous deference. He greeted Devereux like an old friend, his voice soft and low as they exchanged a few words Marcus couldn't quite make out from where he was sitting. There was something off about the way the bartender was acting, Marcus realized. It wasn't just the smile, it was the way his hands trembled slightly as he poured Devereux's drink, the way his eyes darted around the room as if he was afraid of being watched. The bartender, who had been so smug and confident when he had refused to serve Marcus, was now visibly on edge. The contrast was stark, and it set off alarm bells in Marcus's mind. Why was the bartender nervous? Was it just the presence of the powerful arms dealer, or was there something more going on? Marcus had seen this kind of behavior before. People who thought they could play both sides, who thought they were smart enough to outwit both the law and the criminals they were working with. But it rarely ended well for them. Devereux, however, seemed unfazed. He took his drink without a word and moved to a table near the back of the bar, where a man was already seated. The two exchanged brief nods, and Devereux slid into the chair opposite his associate. From where Marcus sat, he couldn't hear their conversation, but he didn't need to. The tension in the air told him everything he needed to know. This was the meeting they had been waiting for. Marcus tapped his earpiece again. "Devereux's meeting someone. I can't hear them from here, but I'll get closer." "Be careful," Sarah's voice warned through the earpiece. "Don't blow your cover." Marcus stood, casually adjusting his suit jacket as he made his way toward the bar, keeping his movements slow and deliberate so as not to draw attention. His heart was pounding, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. He needed to be close enough to overhear what was being said, but far enough away not to arouse suspicion. As he neared the bar, Marcus glanced at the bartender, who was still watching Devereux out of the corner of his eye. There was fear there. Real fear. It was becoming clear to Marcus that the bartender wasn't just nervous about serving the wrong person. He was involved. Deeply involved. And if Marcus was right, he had been working with Devereux for some time. But before Marcus could get any closer, something changed. Devereux, who had been casually sipping his drink just moments ago, suddenly went still. His posture stiffened, and his eyes darted toward the entrance of the bar, scanning the room with an intensity that sent a chill down Marcus's spine. It was as if he sensed something was wrong, as if he knew he was being watched. Marcus froze, his instincts telling him to stay perfectly still. He couldn't afford to make any sudden movements now, not when Devereux was clearly on high alert. His hand hovered near his pocket, where his badge and gun were concealed, ready to act if things went sideways. But he couldn't move, not yet. Then, without warning, Devereux pushed back his chair and stood, his expression tense. He glanced at the bartender, who looked back at him with wide, panicked eyes, and then turned on his heel and made a beeline for the door. "Target's on the move," Marcus hissed into his earpiece, already moving toward the exit. His pulse raced as he weaved through the crowd, careful not to draw attention, but moving quickly enough to keep Devereux in his sights. If he lost him now, the entire operation would fall apart. "Copy that?" Sarah's voice came through the earpiece, steady and calm. "I've got him on the outside. He's heading toward the alley behind the bar. I'll meet you there." Marcus quickened his pace, slipping out the back door just in time to see Devereux disappear around the corner. The alley was dimly lit, shadows stretching across the brick walls like ominous figures. Marcus's breath came in short bursts as he sprinted after the target, adrenaline coursing through his veins. He had to catch him. This was the break they had been waiting for, and he couldn't let Devereux slip away now. As Marcus rounded the corner, the alley opened up into a narrow street, the sounds of the city fading into the background as the chase intensified. The game was on, and Marcus was determined to win. The cool night air hit Marcus's face as he sprinted down the alley, his footsteps echoing off the narrow brick walls. His mind raced as fast as his feet, calculating the next move, piecing together the unfolding puzzle. The target, Victor Devereux, was on the run, and if Marcus didn't act fast, years of work could unravel in seconds. This chase wasn't just about capturing a dangerous criminal. It was personal. The weight of the bartender's earlier humiliation still simmered under Marcus's skin, fueling his determination. He was more than just an agent on a mission now. He was a man proving his worth, not just to himself, but to a world that had often underestimated him. Ahead, Devereux moved with the agility of someone used to running from trouble. His tailored suit and polished shoes didn't seem to slow him down, though Marcus could see the slight hesitation in his steps as they rounded each corner. Devereux wasn't just fleeing aimlessly. He had a plan, a route memorized. But Marcus had chased men like him before. He knew that panic would eventually set in, and when it did, the cracks would start to show. "Where's he heading?" Sarah's voice crackled in Marcus's earpiece, calm and focused despite the high stakes. "He's taking the side streets," Marcus replied, his breath steady despite the adrenaline pumping through his veins. "Looks like he's trying to loop back toward the warehouse district. Keep the car ready." "Already in position. Don't lose him," Sarah said, her voice firm. Marcus pushed harder, weaving between the occasional pedestrian, careful not to let Devereux out of his sight. His long strides carried him faster, each step closing the gap between him and his target. But Devereux wasn't going down without a fight. The man was quick, too quick for someone who had spent so much of his life sitting in luxury. There was a desperation to his movements now. "Thou?" A flicker of fear in his eyes as he glanced back and saw how close Marcus had gotten. The city around them blurred as the chase barreled through quiet streets and narrow alleys. Storefronts, dimly lit apartments, and empty sidewalks passed in flashes. Marcus's training took over, his mind focused solely on calculating every movement, anticipating every twist and turn. He knew Devereux would try something soon, maybe duck into an alley, or make a break through a crowded street to throw Marcus off. He couldn't let that happen. Not tonight. Just as they rounded another corner, Marcus saw his chance. Devereux's pace had faltered, the weight of the chase starting to slow him down. His breath came in heavy gasps, his once confident strides turning into frantic, uneven steps. Marcus, on the other hand, felt his adrenaline surging. He was closing in. "Almost there," Marcus muttered into his earpiece, his eyes locked on Devereux's form ahead. "He's losing steam." Then it happened. Devereux made a sharp left into a narrow alleyway that cut between two abandoned warehouses. Marcus followed without hesitation, knowing this might be his last chance to close the distance before Devereux disappeared into the labyrinth of the industrial district. The alley was tight, barely wide enough for two people to pass side by side. Garbage bins lined the walls, their contents spilling onto the cracked pavement. The sound of Marcus's footsteps pounded in his ears, mixing with the distant hum of the city and the ragged breathing of his target just a few yards ahead. Suddenly, Devereux skidded to a halt, realizing too late that the alley was a dead end. The wall in front of him stretched high, cutting off any chance of escape. Marcus slowed his pace, approaching cautiously. He wasn't about to underestimate the man, not after everything he'd learned about him. Devereux had been evading the law for years, slipping through the cracks, using his money and connections to stay one step ahead of justice. But tonight, it looked like his luck had finally run out. "End of the line, Devereux," Marcus called out, his voice steady but loud enough to echo off the brick walls. Devereux turned, his face pale and slick with sweat. His sharp, angular features were twisted with frustration and fear, emotions he had clearly tried to keep hidden for most of his life. But there was something else in his eyes now. Defeat. "You don't know what you're doing, Agent," Devereux spat, his voice hoarse but defiant. "You think this ends with me? You have no idea who you're dealing with." Marcus's face remained impassive as he slowly approached, keeping a careful distance. His hand hovered near his side, ready to reach for his gun if Devereux tried anything. But the man seemed to know the game was over. His shoulders sagged, and for the first time, Marcus saw the cracks in the facade of the powerful arms dealer. The man who had built an empire on violence and intimidation now looked small, cornered, with nowhere left to run. "I know exactly who I'm dealing with," Marcus replied calmly, his eyes locked on Devereux's. "A man who thought he could run forever. But it looks like time caught up with you." Devereux's mouth twisted into a bitter smile. "You think you've won? This is bigger than you. Bigger than any of you." He stepped back, his eyes flickering toward the wall behind him as if calculating some last-ditch attempt to escape. But Marcus could see the resignation settling in. "That's where you're wrong," Marcus said, his voice firm. "You've been playing both sides for too long, thinking you were untouchable. But there's always an end to the game." For a brief moment, silence fell between them, the tension thick in the narrow alley. Marcus could hear the distant wail of sirens approaching, probably summoned by Sarah as backup. The chase was over, and the weight of victory pressed down on Marcus's shoulders, though it didn't bring the satisfaction he had expected. Devereux leaned against the wall, shaking his head as if the reality of his situation hadn't quite sunk in. "You really think this changes anything? Someone will take my place, Agent. Someone always does." Marcus didn't flinch. "Maybe, but tonight, it's your turn, and you're done." Just as Marcus was about to move in to cuff him, the sound of hurried footsteps approached from the alley entrance. It was Sarah, arriving with her usual precision, her gun drawn but pointed low as she assessed the situation. "Everything good here?" she asked, her voice calm but professional, always sharp and to the point. "Yeah," Marcus replied, his eyes still locked on Devereux. "He's done running." Sarah moved to the side, her sharp gaze scanning the scene for any lingering threats. Devereux remained motionless, his defiance slipping away as the reality of his capture settled in. There was no escape, not this time. Marcus moved in, pulling out his handcuffs. Devereux didn't resist, his hands falling limply to his sides as Marcus secured the cuffs around his wrists. The cold metal clicked into place, a sound that felt final, almost cathartic. "I'll call it in," Sarah said, turning to step back toward the van to notify the rest of their team. "We'll get him processed." As she walked away, Marcus allowed himself a brief moment of reflection. The chase was over, but the night had left its mark on him. The bartender's face flashed in his mind, the arrogance, the disdain, the blatant prejudice that had turned a simple interaction into something much more personal. Marcus had faced racism before, of course, but tonight it felt sharper, more pointed, especially after everything he had accomplished. Even with his badge, his suit, his authority, some people would always see him through the lens of their own ignorance. But as Marcus stood there watching Devereux being led away, he realized something important. The bartender had been wrong. Marcus did belong here. He belonged in this fight, in this role, in this mission. No amount of prejudice or ignorance could take that away from him. The night was far from over, and there was still work to be done. But for now, Marcus allowed himself a small, quiet victory. The target was captured, and justice was one step closer to being served. The adrenaline from the chase still buzzed through Marcus's veins as Devereux was led away in cuffs, his once polished persona crumbling under the weight of reality. But the night wasn't over yet. As Sarah called in the backup, Marcus felt an uneasiness settle in the pit of his stomach. There was something about the bartender, something more than just his offensive attitude. Marcus's instincts told him there was a connection that went deeper than what they had uncovered so far, and he had learned long ago to trust those instincts. The sirens grew louder as police vehicles finally pulled up to the scene, their flashing lights casting eerie shadows across the alley. Officers spilled out, securing the perimeter and preparing to take Devereux into custody. But Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the story, something just out of reach. He turned to Sarah, who was already briefing the officers. "I need to head back to the bar," Marcus said, his voice steady but firm. Sarah looked at him, eyebrow raised. "Why? We've got him. This case is about to be locked down." Marcus glanced toward the alley, where Devereux was being loaded into the back of a squad car, his expression twisted into a bitter sneer. The arms dealer had been defeated, but the smug confidence still lingered in his eyes, like he knew something they didn't. "The bartender," Marcus said quietly, his mind piecing together the fragments of the night. "There's something off about him." He knew more than he let on. I could see it in his face when Devereux walked in. Sarah considered this for a moment, her usual sharp expression softening slightly as she trusted Marcus's judgment. "You think he's involved?" "I don't think I know," Marcus replied, his voice growing more certain. "I don't know how deep it goes yet, but I've seen that look before. He's in too deep, and he's scared. Whatever part he's playing, we can't let him walk away tonight." Sarah nodded, her decision made. "All right, you go. I'll finish processing Devereux and catch up with you." Marcus didn't wait for further instructions. He turned and headed back toward the bar, retracing his steps through the narrow streets. The once vibrant nightlife around him seemed muted now, as if the weight of the case had pressed down on everything else. His mind was focused, replaying every detail of his interaction with the bartender earlier that night. The refusal of service, the thinly veiled contempt in the man's voice, it all made sense now. The bartender had been nervous, not just because of Marcus's presence, but because he was complicit. He was hiding something. When Marcus arrived back at the bar, the atmosphere had shifted. The previously lively crowd had thinned out, and those who remained were scattered, talking in hushed tones. The bartender stood behind the counter, cleaning glasses with mechanical precision, but the smug confidence from earlier had faded. He looked over his shoulder every few seconds, his movements jittery, as if he knew something was coming for him. Marcus walked in, his steps deliberate and slow, his eyes fixed on the bartender. The man noticed him immediately, his face paling as Marcus approached. For a moment, Marcus thought he might try to run, but the bartender stayed rooted to the spot, his hands trembling slightly as he put down the glass he was polishing. "You again," the bartender muttered, trying to maintain the bravado he had displayed earlier, but his voice betrayed him. There was fear there now. Real fear. Marcus leaned against the bar, his expression calm but his eyes hard. "We need to talk." The bartender swallowed, his Adam's apple bobbing nervously in his throat. "About what? I already told you, we don't serve." "This isn't about a drink," Marcus interrupted, his voice cold. "It's about Devereux." The bartender flinched at the name, his eyes darting around the room as if hoping no one else had heard. His reaction confirmed what Marcus already knew. The man was deeply involved. "I don't know what you're talking about," the bartender stammered, but his voice lacked conviction. He was sweating now, the pressure of the situation pressing down on him like a vice. "I just serve drinks, man. I don't get involved in." "Cut the act," Marcus snapped, his patience thinning. "I saw the way you looked at him when he walked in. You're not just some bartender, and we both know it. You're involved in this. The question is, how deep?" The bartender's hand twitched, and Marcus instinctively moved his hand toward his waistband, where his gun was holstered, ready for anything. But instead of reaching for a weapon, the bartender's hand went to his forehead, wiping away the beads of sweat that had formed there. He looked like a man cornered, trapped with no way out. I didn't have a choice, the bartender said, his voice barely above a whisper. You don't understand. Devereux, he's not just some criminal. He's got people everywhere. If I didn't do what he asked, they would have come after me, my family. Marcus narrowed his eyes, his mind racing. It was a familiar story. People getting dragged into criminal enterprises, thinking they could handle it, only to find themselves in too deep, with no way to escape. But that didn't excuse what the bartender had done. He had helped a dangerous man stay in business, whether out of fear or greed. You helped him, Marcus said, his voice low and menacing. You helped a man who's been running guns and selling weapons to people who use them to hurt others. You think that makes you innocent? I didn't want to. The bartender shot back, his voice cracking. I didn't have a choice. You don't know what these people are capable of. Devereux, he made sure I knew I couldn't say no. Marcus stared at him, reading the fear etched across the bartender's face. The man was broken, caught between his own fear and the consequences of his actions. Marcus had seen this before, people who thought they were out of options, who made decisions they could never take back. But his sympathy only went so far. The damage had already been done. You're going to tell me everything you know, Marcus said, his voice cold but measured. Every detail, every deal, every person you've worked with. You're going to come clean, or so help me, I'll make sure you go down with Devereux. The bartender's eyes widened in panic, and for a moment Marcus thought he might break. But instead the man clenched his fists, his face twisting in desperation. I can't, the bartender whispered, his voice trembling. If I talk, they'll kill me. They'll kill my family. The words hung in the air, heavy with dread. Marcus felt the weight of the man's fear pressing down on him, but his resolve remained firm. He had seen enough in his career to know that fear didn't absolve guilt. The bartender had made his choices, and now he had to face the consequences. You think you're safer staying quiet? Marcus asked, his tone dark. Devereux is finished. His operation is done. The only thing that'll save you now is cooperating with us. Otherwise, you'll go down as an accessory. And believe me, prison isn't a place you want to be when word gets out about what you've been involved in. The bartender's face went ashen. He knew Marcus was right. There was no good outcome for him here. But one path was marginally less catastrophic than the other. Before he could respond, the door to the bar swung open and Sarah entered, her presence immediately commanding the room. She caught Marcus's eye and with a nod confirmed what he had already suspected. Devereux was processed. But this wasn't over yet. We've got him, she said, approaching the bar. Devereux is in custody. Now it's time for you to talk. The bartender's shoulders slumped, the last vestiges of resistance draining from his body. He looked from Marcus to Sarah, his face a mask of defeat. He had no more moves left. His part in this game was over. Okay, he whispered, his voice barely audible. I'll talk. The silence in the bar felt suffocating. The bartender's reluctant confession had cracked the tension wide open, but it was far from over. Marcus stood by the counter, his eyes locked on the man who, just hours ago, had humiliated him. The bartender's earlier bravado, the arrogance that had sneered in Marcus's face, was now gone. In its place was fear, raw, desperate fear. The irony wasn't lost on Marcus. The man who had belittled him, reduced him to nothing more than the color of his skin, was now at the mercy of the very system he thought he could avoid. It wasn't Marcus's badge or authority that had forced this change. It was the bartender's own choices, his own actions, that had led him here. Karma had a funny way of catching up with people like him. As the bartender began to talk, his voice was barely above a whisper, the weight of what he was revealing pressing down on him. He started slowly, recounting how Devereux had approached him nearly a year ago. At first, it had been simple. Pass along information about the patrons, no questions asked. In exchange, the bartender would get money, enough to live comfortably. But it hadn't stopped there. The demands had escalated, and soon the bartender was handling more. Introducing Devereux to clients, providing safe spaces for meetings, and eventually facilitating illegal arms deals right under the noses of the bar's elite clientele. The bartender's hands trembled as he spoke, his face pale and drawn. He looked nothing like the confident man who had dismissed Marcus so easily earlier that night. Now, he was a man on the edge, teetering between fear and guilt. I didn't want to get involved, the bartender muttered, his eyes darting toward Marcus but never meeting his gaze. But once you're in, there's no way out. Devereux, he's got people everywhere. He said if I tried to back out, they'd come for me, for my family. Marcus's jaw tightened. He had heard stories like this before. Ordinary people pulled into the orbit of powerful criminals, convinced that they had no choice but to obey. But there was always a choice, Marcus knew. The bartender had made his, and now he would have to live with the consequences. You could have said no, Marcus said, his voice steady but cold. You could have walked away before it got this far. The bartender's eyes flashed with something like anger, but it quickly faded into defeat. He slumped against the bar, his head in his hands. You think it's that easy? You don't know what these people are like. They don't just let you walk away. They destroy everything. I couldn't risk it. Marcus didn't respond immediately. He understood fear. He had faced it in many forms throughout his life, but fear didn't justify actions that hurt others. The bartender had become part of a machine that funneled weapons into the hands of criminals, enabling violence and suffering. Fear might have been his motivation, but it didn't absolve him of responsibility. The door to the bar creaked open, and Marcus glanced up as Sarah re-entered, flanked by 2 police officers. The officers moved quickly, their expressions grim as they approached the bartender. It was time for him to face the consequences of his actions. The bartender didn't resist as they placed him in handcuffs, his head bowed low, his shoulders slumped in resignation. His earlier defiance, the sneering arrogance that had tried to dismiss Marcus as less than, was long gone. Now he was just a man trapped in the web he had helped weave, caught by his own greed and fear. As the officers led him out of the bar, Marcus couldn't help but feel a surge of conflicting emotions. There was no satisfaction in seeing the bartender brought down like this, no sense of triumph. Marcus had seen too many people fall to their own poor choices to take any pleasure in it. But there was a kind of justice in it. A poetic end to a night filled with prejudice, betrayal, and deception. Sarah stood beside Marcus, her eyes following the officers as they escorted the bartender out of the bar. She didn't say anything at first, her expression thoughtful as she processed the events of the night. After a moment she turned to Marcus, her gaze softening. "You were right," she said quietly. "About the bartender. He was deeper in this than we thought." Marcus nodded, but he couldn't shake the heavy feeling in his chest. "He's not the first," he said, his voice low, "and he won't be the last." Sarah sighed, crossing her arms as she leaned against the bar. "That's the world we live in. People get desperate, make bad choices, and end up paying the price." Marcus glanced around the bar, the once luxurious setting now feeling empty and cold. The night had been a reminder of how quickly things could change, how power and wealth could crumble in an instant. The bartender had thought he was untouchable, hiding behind his job and his privilege, and the assumption that someone like Marcus didn't belong in his world. But karma had a way of balancing the scales. Marcus felt a sense of closure, but it wasn't the kind of closure he had expected. It wasn't the satisfaction of revenge or the thrill of seeing justice served. It was quieter, more introspective. The bartender had been wrong about a lot of things, but most of all, he had been wrong about Marcus. For so much of his life, Marcus had been underestimated. People saw his skin, his background, and made assumptions. Even with his badge, his authority, and his years of service, there were still people who couldn't see past their own biases. The bartender had been one of those people, and tonight had been a reminder that no matter how far Marcus had come, there would always be people who tried to define him by something as superficial as the color of his skin. But tonight, Marcus had proven something to himself. He hadn't let the bartender's prejudice stop him. He hadn't let it affect his judgment or cloud his mission. He had done his job, and he had done it well. And in the end, the bartender's own actions had been his downfall, not anything Marcus had done. As the night wound down, Marcus and Sarah walked out of the bar together, the cool air refreshing after the heat and tension inside. The city's lights twinkled in the distance, and for a moment everything felt peaceful. The mission was over, and another criminal was off the streets. But more than that, Marcus felt a deeper sense of validation. He had faced prejudice head-on and had come out the other side stronger for it. As they reached their car, Sarah turned to him with a faint smile. "You did good tonight?" she said. "Better than good, actually." Marcus gave her a nod of thanks, though his mind was already moving forward. There was always another case, another mission. The fight for justice never really ended. But tonight, for the first time in a long while, Marcus allowed himself a moment of reflection. Karma had done its work. The bartender's fate was sealed, and Devereux would spend the rest of his life behind bars. But for Marcus, the real victory wasn't just in seeing them brought to justice. It was in knowing that, no matter how many people tried to bring him down, no matter how many obstacles he faced, he would always rise above it. Because Marcus wasn't defined by what others thought of him. He was defined by his actions, his integrity, and his unwavering commitment to doing what was right. And as the car pulled away from the bar, disappearing into the quiet streets, Marcus felt a weight lift from his shoulders. The night had been long, but it was over now. And for the first time in a long time, Marcus felt a sense of peace. The road ahead was still uncertain, but one thing was clear. No matter what came next, Marcus would be ready. Thanks for joining us. If you enjoyed this story, don't miss the next one. Click on the video now to watch. We appreciate your support and we'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments.